You're listening to the Business for Good podcast, the show where you'll hear inspirational stories about companies making money by solving some of the world's most pressing problems. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, and I'm glad you've joined us. Welcome, friend, to episode number 144 of the Business for Good podcast. I appreciate each of you who reached out with positive feedback on the last episode with Maya Sapir-Mir from Palopo. I love what they are doing by growing egg proteins inside of potatoes, and I very much hope they succeed. Now, speaking of success, our guest on this episode is someone who's already had a lot of it. Of course, her work is far from over, but I've known and admired the guest on this episode for 19 years now, and I was thrilled to get to talk with her about her life's work and legacy. Maisie Ganzler has never worked at an animal welfare charity nor an alternative protein company, yet she is in the upper echelon, as far as I'm concerned, of effectiveness when it comes to reducing the suffering of farmed animals. That's because she has served as an executive of a national food management company supplying 1,000 schools and corporate dining facilities, Bon Appetit Management Company, for decades. In her career, Maisie pioneered some of the first ever corporate policies to require suppliers to stop using battery cages for laying hens and gestation crates for breeding pigs, meat reduction policies, and a whole host of other important animal welfare and sustainability initiatives. When Bon Appetit would implement a policy like those I just mentioned, it was often seen as leading edge at the time, yet eventually would become the norm among food service companies. For example, Bon Appetit's 2005 cage-free egg policy would come to be adopted by McDonald's a decade later. Maisie even ran for McDonald's board of directors, backed by billionaire Carl Icahn, a campaign that she writes the fast food giant company spent $16 million to defeat. While she didn't make it onto McDonald's board, Maisie does sit on the board of directors of an alternative protein company called Air Protein, whose CEO Lisa Dyson has been a guest on this show before. So it was with great pleasure that I learned that Maisie has come out with her first book, which is part autobiography and part guide for others on how to create meaningful change in our food and agricultural systems. The book, which just recently came out, is called You Can't Market Manure at Lunchtime and Other Lessons from the Food Industry for Creating a More Sustainable Company. I read it and found it both informational, inspirational, and entertaining. What more could you want? Well, maybe you'd want to hear Maisie's story straight from her rather than from me, so enjoy this conversation with a true pioneer for animals, for farm workers, and everyone who wants to build a better food system. Maisie, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
Thank you, Paul. It's really exciting to be here. I'm a fan.
I am a fan of yours, as you know. I've been a fan of yours for probably about 19 years here since I first heard your name cross my consciousness in 2005. And I'm eager to talk about that. But first, I just got to say, I read your book, which I really enjoyed. And I thought it was quite not only insightful and useful, but also funny. And I always like it when authors actually make the book not just informational, but also, entertaining. And you had a lot of good jokes and puns. I like when you're talking about moving away from gestation crates. You said you drew a line in the mud. That was pretty good. Considering there is no mud on the factory farms, just manure. You could have even, gone with drawing a line in the manure, I guess. But it was good. And it was representative of your personality, too. It wasn't like you lost the Maisie personality in order to write the book. So I appreciate that very much.
Thank you. I really wanted the book to be readable, conversational, full of stories, and a quick read rather than an academic slog.
Yeah.
I'm glad that came through.
I would go so far as to call it a breezy read, not just quick, but breezy, because it was pleasant, not just fast. And I especially liked you actually had a joke in the book that I have made before. And so this is a great place where I noticed that we both came to the same conclusion. So you're talking about the Walker Hayes song Fancy, which if you haven't listened to the song, it's a really good song. So go check it out. But in the song, Walker Hayes is talking about where he's going to Applebee's, he's getting the bourbon steak with an Oreo shake. And more than once, I have karaoke'd this song with my wife, and I've converted the lyrics to be animal friendlier. So rather than the bourbon steak, I talk about getting the plant-based steak and a plant-based shake and all that. And you did the same thing in the book with the Impossible steak and all that. I thought, wow, two great minds are thinking alike here.
That's so funny. Actually, kind of insider tidbit that I haven't told anybody is that...
Oh, wow. Well, you can tell me. It's just the two of us.
Right. The original line in the book, the context is I'm talking about telling stories and to explain things about your brand and to get customers interested. And I'm talking about using pop culture references and a conversational style. And the original line in the book, I quoted a Lizzo song. And my editor actually said, I don't think we can talk about Lizzo because Lizzo there was a big lawsuit around creating a hostile work environment. And so Lizzo has been canceled from the Harvard Business Review press. But
wow. Okay. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, but I will tell you, I personally would be more likely to get the Walker Hayes reference than a Lizzo reference. So I loved it. And I like the song a lot because it actually reminds me of Tony, my wife, who is extremely frugal for the most part and is the type of person who would be quite happy on our anniversary to go to Chipotle. So it's one reason I think that we ended up getting married, since we shared a love of many things, including frugality.
And isn't it amazing that we live in a time that you could get a plant-based item at Applebee's?
Yeah.
I mean, just 10 years ago, that wasn't really in the realm of possibility, that at Burger King, you could get Impossible, that through Stream chicken nuggets, you could get Better Meat Co. ingredients. It's really come an incredible distance.
It's very kind of you. You definitely know your audience, so my hat is off to you for that. So thank you. But yeah, I routinely comment that I cannot believe that I have lived long enough to see so many of the things that we see now, both in terms of plant-based advancements, but also just, artificial intelligence and the ability to do, video streaming anywhere, anytime for virtually no cost with anyone on the planet. I mean, these are things that when you think about Greek mythology, they never dreamt of the gods being capable of the type of things that we take for granted today. It's really, really amazing. And they certainly weren't dreaming of making meat without animals. So, it is really, really incredible. But I want to get to the topic and the main thrust of your book, because, not only put words in your mouth, but having read the entire book word for word, your basic argument, Maisie, is that, you can change the world and you can make money while you're doing it. And so everybody knows that it can be very profitable to do harm in the world, right? Like, oil companies, tobacco companies, factory farming, and so on. But you're basically making the argument that actually doing good can be profitable, right? That you don't have to make money just by doing harm, but that doing the right thing can actually not just be righteous, but also profitable. So for some people who are listening to others say, oh, come on, that's just a ruse. All you care about is profit. So tell me, why do you think it is that doing good and making profit can go hand in hand?
I think that doing good and making profit go hand in hand when you authentically do good, where you make actual and meaningful change. I think that the marketplace will reward you for that. That you look at any study about millennials or Gen Z, and it says that they want to support companies that align with their values. And you also see studies saying about their concern about climate change. I mean, I'm sure, Paul, that you could quote 100 studies showing that animal welfare scores very highly on any consumer research, that every time that there's been an ability for the U.S. public to vote for better treatment of animals, it overwhelmingly has won. So why would we think that we won't be rewarded from a business perspective for caring for these same issues that people are saying over and over that they care about? That said, you have to, again, make really authentic change, make really meaningful change, and tell your story well so that people can understand what you're doing and give you the credit for it.
So let me ask you about that, because you talk about how nobody's going to buy your food because of your manure management policy, right? Like you're not going to sell more sandwiches because the company you're representing has mandated better manure management policies from their farmers, right? But you are saying that you think that you can actually get more accounts, like more corporate accounts signed up because of it. So what's the difference there between the behavior of the institution and the behavior of the individual student or diner at that cafeteria?
Well, for Bon Appetit Management Company, as you're pointing out, there's two customers. There's what we would call the client, which is the person at an institution who's making the decision to contract with Bon Appetit. And that would be on the corporate side, somebody in facilities management or in human resources, if they think of food program as an employee benefit. On the school side, somebody who's in charge of student services or a CFO. They're making the decision about which company to contract with. And then there's a secondary customer who's the person who's eating the food on a day-to-day basis. That would be the corporate employee or the student. And they both care about these issues, but they care about the issues in different ways, and they have different amounts of money to spend. So something that's as complex as manure management is going to be really hard to talk about at lunchtime. That's the title of my book. You can't market manure at lunchtime. And so probably isn't going to be the issue that the student on a day-to-day basis is going to make a decision based upon. However, in the longer sell, which is the time to get the contract, we have more time to explain what we're doing. And more institutions, be they colleges or corporations, are interested in the impacts of their supply chains.
So if that is so, it's clear to me, like you're basically making the argument, let's say you're supplying the Google cafeteria and you're saying like the person in charge of buying for Google from a food service company like Bon Appetit Management Company, they are more interested in your sustainability and animal welfare, et cetera, policies than the individual diner. Is that accurate or am I misrepresenting that?
They are more interested in the ins and outs and the specific details because they have the time to research and to really compare. The actual Google diner, hypothetically, does care about animal welfare, does care about environmental policy, but they don't have the time to wade into the details of manure management. But they do want to know the broad strokes of that you are environmentally friendly, that any awards you win, any grades that you might earn from an organization like the Humane Society of the United States just released a scorecard on protein sustainability. If you scored well on that, if you got an A+, as Bon Appetit did several years ago, that you do want to tell to your day-to-day customer, that quick hit of information, yes, that customer wants to know. The details and the intricacies, the buyer at the contract level has time to talk about.
Got it. Okay. That is quite interesting. So that is a unique proposition for a food service company like Bon Appetit. What about a company that just makes consumer brand products, right? So they only have individual consumers. How could they benefit? So let's say you're talking about a CPG brand. They only sell in grocery stores where it's only individual consumers. Obviously, there's a buyer for the grocery store who's going to put them on the shelf. But can they benefit, do you think, from, let's say, making the same type of policies relating to agricultural sustainability?
Absolutely. As you said, there is a buyer. And so just like there's somebody that we're contracting with at Bon Appetit for our food services, there is a buyer at Walmart or Kroger's or Safeway, at Whole Foods. And that person knows a lot about these issues. And they probably have passion about some aspect of sustainability and animal welfare. And they want to know the intricacies, the ins and the outs. Then for the customer that's coming in on a day-to-day basis, you've got two options of where you present your information. You've got on package. And I think that on package, you've got to have a bold headline that is eye-catching and simple. And then you've got your website, of course. And a very small portion of your customers are going to go and dig around your website. But those that do need to have good information available to them. I always think about the model of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch program, where they put out originally a pocket guide, which was a simple list of seafood put into three categories: best choices, good alternatives, and avoid. Then on their website, they had a paragraph about why for each of those ratings a seafood item was ranked. And then if you clicked further, you got the full scientific report. So the majority of people just want the pocket guide. Some people want the paragraph, but those who really understand these issues and really care, maybe the skeptics, the whole report is there. And I think that's a good model for all of us.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I oftentimes think about consumer choices as similar to voting, because we are voting for the type of world that we want. And I think about myself as a voter, and, you know, my self-perception is that I'm somebody who's interested in public policy, but still, I usually just go look at the endorsements for candidates, because I figure that the organizations that are rating or endorsing or opposing candidates have done way more research than I'm going to do. They probably have way more information than I'm ever going to go seek out. And I use them like as a proxy, so if the environmental organizations are in favor of a particular candidate, I'm more likely to look favorably upon that candidate without knowing anything else that I've done on my own. It's kind of like, even though, I care about it, am I going to go research each one of these candidates and all of their policy positions? Or am I just going to say, hey, the people I trust are endorsing or opposing this particular candidate? And so that's kind of similar to what you're saying. Basically, the average consumer really just wants to know, how do they score on this scorecard, right? Whether it's the Humane Society or, Sierra Club or whoever it is. And so that's one of the things that you did masterfully and continue to do in your career at Bon Appetit was forge these relationships with those trusted messengers, right? With the NGOs and others who people are looking to. And I'll never forget, back in 2005, you tell the story in the book about working with our mutual friend, Josh Balk, and how he sent you in 2005 a VHS tape about chickens in battery cages. And it's quite a trajectory. I'm sure when you got that VHS tape in the mail, little would you know that more than a decade later, you would be running for the board of directors of McDonald's on a related issue. So the cage-free campaigns that were really prominent at that time, back from like 2005 through 2015 and beyond, were really spearheaded by you. There was no big companies that had national cage-free egg policies at that time. The percentage of cage-free eggs in the market was like maybe around 1% at the most. And yet you made the decision to phase out eggs from caged hens at a time when now all these companies have those policies. But at the time, nobody had those policies. And we all know, like, it can look so self-executing when you look in the rearview mirror. Well, of course, this is all going to happen. But needless to say, progress isn't self-executing. It happens because there are pioneers and leaders who make it happen and then clear a path for others to follow, which is what you did. So what was it that led you to think not only should you do this, because you talked about how you didn't really contemplate chickens that much prior to this, but what was it that led you to think not only that you should do it, but that you actually could do it?
There's a few things that all coalesced in 2005 around cage-free eggs that told me that it was the right thing to do. First was, as you said, Josh sent me this VHS tape, and I saw these animals crowded into these barren battery cages, unable to raise their wings, with their poop literally falling down on the chickens below, heads stuck in between wires, unable to drink and eat. It was really horrific. And so just as a human being, I thought, I don't want to be part of this system. I don't want to be supporting it. That's the first place, the honest commitment to change. Then we get to making the business case about it, because we are talking about for-profit business. And as you've said, I'm making the argument that you can do both, that you can make money by doing good. So the second piece was, where did I find out about the issue? It started with a question from one student at American University, David Benzaquin, who we now both still know 20 years later, 19 years later, has become quite a force in the plant-based world. But at that point, he was an undergrad, and he asked a question. So it started with one customer indicating to me that there was interest in this issue. Then it was paired with a powerful NGO, the Humane Society, who was launching campaigns. And I thought, this is my indication that something is brewing, that this is going to become a trend. The Humane Society is not going to stop. They are starting. They're just gearing up. And students are not going to stop caring about this. This is just the first one of many. So how can I be out ahead? We then connected with a certification, Humane Certified or Certified Humane, who was also gearing up and certifying. So I knew that there were all of these indications that this was going to become a big issue. Now, have I always been right? No. There have been issues that I've taken a stand on thinking I had all of these indicators and that I cared about that wound up not catching on to public opinion, not becoming big business benefits. But you have to take risks. If you want to be a leader, by definition, you're going to be doing something that nobody has done before. So you look at all the indicators and see if you can make it work financially. In the case of cage-free eggs, at the time, the egg market was very volatile. Pricing was all over the place, but cage-free eggs were very steady. So we were able to clearly predict what the cost increase was going to be. And the next question everybody asked is, did you pass that cost increase on to consumers? Well, we didn't, because we're not selling eggs. We're selling cakes or omelets or other foods made with eggs. And it was very hard to say to a customer, this cake is 5 cents more because of the cage-free egg, right? But we thought that we would get enough public praise, enough praise from our customers, and enough goodwill to compensate for the increase in ingredient price.
And obviously you did. I mean, you were widely touted, not just by the Humane Society, but by a whole host of organizations and charities out there as the leader that helped to tip off this set of dominoes. Because in 2005, Bon Appetit said no more cages for laying hens. And then that led to a whole sequence of events where other food service providers started doing the same. Other grocery chains started doing the same, all the way to 2015 when McDonald's said that it was doing the same. And then that led to Burger King and Wendy's and all the other big fast food companies. And so in a very real sense, you played an extremely consequential role in getting tens or maybe even hundreds of millions of animals out of these cages. And as you point out, it all started with one person, Dave Benzikin, messaging you about this, and then you getting a VHS tape in the mail. And I'll never forget, I was sitting next to Josh Balk when he was on the phone with you, and you were describing to him that you were going to adopt this policy. And he was trying to keep his cool, right? Like he was trying to be on the phone and be professional with you. But this was really the first big win for the campaign. And as soon as he hung up, it was like, we had just won the Super Bowl, it was like this thing, like we devoted our lives to trying to help these animals. And now here was the actual tangible benefits of what we were doing. And it led to a lot more. Oh, go on. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. And who doesn't want to be part of winning the Super Bowl? I mean, it's fun on the other side, too, to be out front, to make change, to know that you're impacting millions of animals. That feels great, selfishly. So I want to be part of winning the Super Bowl, too.
Well, when I say we, I meant us together, because we never viewed these companies as like the other team, right? We viewed battery cages as the other team. And so when we were, talking about winning, we were talking about winning with companies to get rid of the actual other team, which was the battery cage system. And absolutely, we felt that way. And it led to, the gestation crate policies as well, which also were in many ways initiated by Bon Appetit and other companies. And I particularly appreciated your story about the difficulties of getting rid of gestation crates compared to battery cages in the book, because it's a lot harder, because you're dealing not just with the pigs who are being sold for food, but it's really the parent generation. And then you have this other complexity of the pork companies saying they're going to group housing, but not necessarily going gestation crate free, which is a little sleight of hand, and how you ultimately prevailed by ditching your pork supplier, which in that case was Smithfield, and moving to another company who would provide totally gestation crate free pork. So do you want to just briefly outline the challenges that you had with that? And then I want to move into one other issue where you also talked about some challenges.
Well, the gestation crate issue would be one that I'd say we had lots of wins and lots of losses along the path. Every time I thought that I had made progress, it often turned out that I hadn't. And what that was about was we had gotten Smithfield, our pork supplier, to agree to eliminate gestation crates. And then, as you indicated, they asked for a change in language for us to stop saying no gestation crates and start saying group housed. And I said, what's that about? And it was then explained to me that the sows, the pregnant moms, were still being kept in gestation crates till the confirmation of pregnancy. So if a sow is pregnant for 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days, just about 4 months, they were spending almost a quarter of that time still in the gestation crate until pregnancy was confirmed. And that was very much not the spirit of the policy, nor the letter of the policy that I had written. So after I had gone out and told people publicly that we were gestation crate free, I had to then eat crow and say, turns out, not really. But I wanted that message to come from me. And that's one of the big lessons in my book, is that when you fall short, and you will fall short, there is no way, if you're taking a leadership position on these issues, that you're not going to stumble. So when you do, be honest, be transparent, and you put the message out. There's no gotcha if you're the one telling the story. So I called our old buddy, Josh Balk, again and said, hey, Josh, turns out that statement I made, not really true. Here's what the real deal is. And he introduced me to a new pork supplier, Clemens Food Group, who was keeping the sows in gestation crates just for insemination. So about a week, as opposed to the month that Smithfield was keeping the pigs crated for, which was a huge improvement, but still not the total win. It wasn't until Prop 12 passed in California where it really disallowed any use of gestation crates that Clemens made the full transition to being truly gestation crate free. And note that I'm saying gestation crate free because there's still farrowing crates involved, right? So we're not saying crate free. The words matter. And that's another lesson in my book about getting your story straight, making sure that everybody in your organization understands all of these terms and can speak to them with fluency, or else you will not sound authentic. And that story of Smithfield misleading us and of asking us to change the policy, unfortunately, has repeated itself again and again. McDonald's had the same experience and has actually changed their policy. Denny's has just changed their policy. There's many companies that are not standing by their original commitment to eliminate gestation crates, and they are being called out as they should be. They are not getting business benefit.
Yeah, so this is a tough thing to contemplate because people work so hard, including yourself, to implement these policies, right? These policies don't just happen, right? They happen because there's a lot of hard work that goes into them. And then when companies start backing out, there has to be some consequence, right? It can't just be that they get the positive attention from adopting a policy and then 5 or 10 years later they back out of it and nothing happens. And I think that's the premise of what Josh Balk's new organization, the Accountability Board, is doing. And we'll link to their website on the show notes for this episode at businessforgoodpodcast.com. But that brings us to the more difficult question for animal welfare. We've talked about cages and crates for laying hens and breeding sows. But you write in the book about the Better Chicken Commitment, which is designed to try to help those chickens who are raised for food, oftentimes called broilers. And what you write, I'm just going to quote, you said, by your math, you said by my math, every single one of these 200 companies is going to adopted these policies is going to be unable to fully reach their promise, including your own, Bon Appetit. And you said, if history is an indicator, the animal welfare groups are going to go from singing our praises to pointing out our, quote, lies. Instead of a point of pride to brag about on corporate websites, the Better Chicken Commitment will become a black eye that companies will cover up and hope their customers don't ask about. We're headed for embarrassment, to say the least, and the chickens will still be growing faster than their legs can properly hold them up. So why do you say that? Why is the Better Chicken Commitment actual rollout going so much worse than battery cages or even gestation crates, in your view?
The Better Chicken Commitment has many components to it, but I'll break them into two categories. One is about the physical place that the chickens are kept, and that is akin to gestation crates and to battery cages. It's about the density of the chickens, the lighting, the windows, so the physical barn. The other component of the Better Chicken Commitment is about the genetics of the chicken, how fast the chickens grow. And one is much easier to solve than the other. So the physical buildings and enrichments and windows, that's merely a question of economics. It costs X number of dollars to have fewer chickens in the barn. It costs Y number of dollars to have enrichments. And enrichments, it's a fancy word, but it's literally like boxes and ladders for the chickens to climb up. It's really simple. So it's easy to wrap your head around, and either you can pay for it or you can't. The genetics is another bag of tricks, let's say. It involves much more research into what actually does a slower growing chicken look like. What are the benefits of different breeds? We very broadly say leg health, but when you get into the actual animal behaviorists and the studies they do, it's all kinds of things like putting little Fitbits on chickens and seeing how much movement they make at different stages in their development. There's a one where they put chickens and had them stand in water to see how long they would stand up, because chickens don't like to sit in water. So there's this huge body of knowledge that has to be developed. And then the genetics have to be changed. And many people erroneously think that chickens have those big breasts because they are injected with hormones or because of antibiotics use. Those big breasts are a genetic trait that has been bred into them, and it will take many years to breed it out of them. So it's a much tougher question and much more expensive. And I salute Compassion in World Farming, who has been the holder of the Better Chicken commitment on the NGO side, for working with companies for actually changing the timelines. So thus far, nobody is out of compliance with the Better Chicken commitment because Compassion changed the timeline. They changed the deadline, but they've been really active partners. There's something called the Broiler Working Group that meets on a quarterly basis, and it's about 60 companies that are actively working together to figure out this problem with a consultant that's paid for by Compassion. And we are not there yet.
So what do you think is going to happen? I mean, will they just keep on delaying the deadline until somebody gets it right? Or do you think that there will come a time when there is just going to be condemnation that the companies allegedly didn't take this seriously enough, or what you called, quote, lies in the book? Is that, when do you think there is less accommodation and more confrontation?
I think that some companies, like Bon Appetit, are going to make a change within the next couple years. There's now one producer of scale that has a few farms that meet the Better Chicken commitment guidelines. And I think that there's going to be a crush of companies that want that chicken. There's not enough on the market, but some companies are going to win, and they'll have a percent of their supply BCC compliant. Not 100%, but it'll start at 10% and hopefully grow. And I think that certain NGO groups will celebrate that. If we look at past history, we'll say, great, thank you for doing 10%. When are you going to get to 15? And some groups will start condemning them and say, you promised 100. Why are you only at 10?
Right. And this is really the way that the cage-free campaigns began, was by companies committing to go a certain percentage cage-free by a certain date. And then eventually it was 100% for everybody was the goal. You write in the book, Maisie, about this, that there are trade-offs for everything, right? And one of the trade-offs that you note about these animal welfare improvements, let's take the Better Chicken commitment as an example, is, generally speaking, let's just say the chickens are going to need more space. So you've got fewer chickens per barn. And they're going to grow slower, so you have to keep them alive longer, which means you need more feed. So for the same amount of meat, you need basically more barns and more feed, which basically means higher environmental footprint, right? You need to grow more acres of corn, which means more deforestation. So how do you weigh that? Like, if you're looking at the obligation to improve animal welfare, and you're also looking at the obligation to try to reduce the footprint of the food chain, how do you weigh these competing demands?
Well, each company is going to have to weigh it differently. And my first lesson in the book is how to pick your battles, to decide what your area of concern most importantly is. If you look at a company like Impossible, and Pat Brown, when he started, was very, very focused on climate change, on beef's impact on climate. So he's looking through one very specific lens. You need to decide what the lens of your company is and what's most important to you. Now, many of these companies that have signed the BCC also have climate commitments. And the climate commitments are the only ones, if they're publicly traded, that are actually regulated by the SEC. So they're going to be harder to back away from. So there may be a trade-off in not meeting your chicken commitment, but of actually purchasing less chicken, of moving towards more plant-based options so that you can meet both commitments, your animal welfare commitment and your climate commitment.
Right. And it would be a double win for animal welfare in that particular case, obviously. Then, and you write a little bit about this, although not as much in the book, about the trade-offs with organic. And you mentioned that, well, first of all, with organic, it doesn't mean no pesticides, right? Like they're still using pesticides, which is a common misperception that organic means no pesticides, but they still can use pesticides, just not the same kinds of pesticides. But generally speaking, organic produces in general about 20% less food per acre than the conventional, which means 20% more deforestation. And I've struggled with this myself. And we had on a guest on the show, Professor Robert Paulberg from Harvard, who wrote this really insightful book called Resetting the Table, which I think you might be interested in. We'll link to that in the show notes here, in which he's arguing that, organic isn't as good as many people would think. And I used to be of the impression like, oh, clearly organic is better. But now I have a more nuanced view as to what the trade-offs are. Like certainly there are some things that are better and there are some things that aren't. And I'm wondering how you personally think about this, not in terms of, goals for Bon Appetit, but you write about GMOs and organic in the book. Like how do you, Maisie, think about this? Would you think, like if you're in the store and you see two products, organic or non-organic, would you opt for one over the other for any reason?
Well, I'm in a really lucky position in that I live in Santa Cruz, California, which has a higher percentage of land in organic production than any other place in the country, and has a plethora of small local farms. So I have the opportunity to know my farmers in a way that not everybody does. And I try to support places that use what I would call organic practices, which is a little bit different than certified organic. And what that means is that they're trying to reduce pesticide use as much as possible, but they still use it judiciously in extreme conditions if there is a fungal breakout, for example. And I have the ability to ask my farmers those questions and have discussions. So if you ask me personally, that is my approach, which would be different than as a large purchaser or somebody who lives in Alaska.
Right. Okay. You talk about this really interesting story of Dan Barber in the book, where basically, he's this celebrated chef and he basically, gets derided for not apparently living up to the standards that he was claimed to be setting. And there's a term for this. You don't use it in the book, but there's a term for this called the spouting whale effect, which is that it's, the spouting whale is the one who gets harpooned. Right. And I've noticed this, that companies which like to talk a big game about all their social responsibility commitments or the sustainability commitments, generally get criticized more than the ones who don't talk about it, because there's an apparent allegation of hypocrisy, right? Like if you think that this company says they're acting so righteously, and then in fact, it turns out they're doing something that's quite bad, it seems like more of a scandal than a company that just never pretended to be doing good in the first place. And there's no company that represents social responsibility in the food system more than Bon Appetit. It is the leader. You talk about this in the book, but it's just indisputable, right? It is the leader when it comes to the cutting edge policies on social responsibility. So how do you navigate that? Like, how do you prevent Bon Appetit from being the spouting whale all the time? Because I don't see Bon Appetit getting that type of criticism. Maybe it does happen, but I haven't seen it. Like, why is Bon Appetit not the spouting whale in the way that Dan Barber was?
Because I tried to be honest about our failings before anybody even asked. We go back to that story about the gestation crates. When it turned out that we weren't meeting our own policy and we had failed, I put out a press release. Now, in reality, nobody picked up the press release. It wasn't really a big story, but it was a risk. And it still today sits on our website. If you look back in the annals of the website, there is something in our voice saying we failed. So nobody can harpoon me if I'm being honest, right? The story about Dan Barber, in the retelling sounds so silly. So I talk about an Eater article that exposes that Dan was serving a dish that was supposed to be made completely of this badger flame beet that he had helped develop the seeds for. And in fact, he was actually combining the badger flame beets with golden beets. That's it, right? Like,
What?
that's the scandal.
This guy, it's like there's no difference between him and Bernie Madoff, clearly.
Totally.
Yeah, no, it's so funny that you just enumerated the story because I actually didn't, because I thought it was such a non-issue. I thought, oh, there'll just be like nobody will care about the beet story. But it's funny because it's like this is in that world. That was actually a scandal. And it was a scandal to a journalist and to an editor at Eater, right? Whether anybody actually cared, that's unclear. But to somebody who thought they could get clicks by, accusing Dan of being a hypocrite, they thought that would be something. But yes.
And in fairness, they say it's a pattern. So they also used another example about that they used to have a compost driven oven and that they were sort of faking the eggs being cooked in it. But I think the real point is that Dan put forth this utopian vision of perfection, and people want to knock that down, just like they want to knock down J-Lo and Ben Affleck, right? If you put out anything saying like, I'm doing something more beautifully than you ever could, people want to harpoon that.
Yeah, that's so true. It's so true. In fact, this is what I think is happening. This goes back to a couple of episodes ago. We had on Uma Valetti from Upside Foods, and he's raised an enormous amount of money, like over $500 million that he has raised. His company became a unicorn. They're still a unicorn while being pre-revenue essentially. And there's a lot of people who are quite envious of that. And so people are accusing him of doing something similar to what Dan was accused of, which is basically running a Potemkin village, right? Like that. This is something that's all for show, and that isn't actually what they say it is. And I think in Uma's case, he's quite vociferous about the fact that he is not running a Potemkin village, that he's staging a real village that will be populated with people in the coming years and be a real representation of, in this case, I guess, 18th century Russia. So to keep the Potemkin village analogy going. But yes, I think, what you're saying resonates with me because it's when people are, it's a little bit different from the spouting wheel, but it's like the tallest tree gets cut down. If you're the tallest tree, people generally don't think, oh, I'm so glad they're tall. Good for them. They think, I want to cut them down. Okay. So speaking of cutting down, actually, a good segue. You write in the book that you're talking about BAMCO, or Bon Appetit Management Company. You say that we haven't gone far enough. We could have been stronger and more vocal about factory farms. We tried, but we haven't solved the problems of chicken or beef production. So, it's an interesting claim, but what more do you think that BAMCO could have or should today do? Like you're saying, we haven't done enough. We haven't solved these problems. What more could it be doing?
Well, specifically, that quote is actually from Fidel Baccio, the CEO of Bon Appetit Management Company, not from me.
Thank you for the correction. So if you were asking Fidel and say, okay, we haven't done enough, Fidel, what should we be doing? What would he say?
I think Fidel is a great example of a visionary leader who wants to go fast and wants to go far. And that was a great partnership that he and I had, that he had these visions and then I had to figure out the details of. And so he would say we should stop using industrially raised meat altogether. And then I would say, well, where are we going to get the meat from? And my first reaction is always like, that's hard. We can't do it. And then I go back to my desk and go, okay, how do we actually do this? So then I would start contacting farm to fork vendors, which are our small local suppliers, and say, how many more animals could you raise for us? And then I would go to Clemens Food Group, which is a large supplier, but with a different commitment to animal welfare than some of the other large suppliers, and say, what are you working on? What could we do more? I mentioned earlier in our conversation, farrowing crates. So when a sow is giving birth, they're put into what's called a farrowing crate, which is larger than a gestation crate, but they are still somewhat immobilized while they're giving birth and while they care for their piglets for the first few days or weeks of their lives. That's the next issue. Right? So when we get gestation crates taken care of, we don't get to just sit back and go, woohoo, everything's fine. Now we look at the next one. Farrowing crates is next. When we look at food waste, there is still much more to do. So the Bon Appetit tagline is food services for a sustainable future, and it's about a vision. It's about a sustainable future. Sustainability is not a place that we stop and we declare done.
Right. Yeah. You want continuous improvement. You make that very clear in the book that the whole goal is not perfection, but progress. You just want to keep on making continuous improvement for sure. So when I think about continuous improvement, you alluded earlier in the interview to a point where maybe you would just use less chicken, right? And that to me seems like the obvious answer to so many of these problems, right? Like you're not going to be able to supply tens of thousands of people on a daily basis with meat that didn't come from industrially raised meat, right? You're just not going to be able to do it. Like the amount of meat that people eat in America today and in much of the developed world is just so high that it really can't be provided without factory farming or some other animal-free method of meat production, whether it's cultivated meat or plant-based meat or et cetera. And so where do you see that going? Like, do you think that it's going to become more common for food service providers to have benchmarks to say, okay, we're going to reduce our meat demand by X% by X year? And Bon Appetit did this with beef a long time ago. So we're going to reduce it. I don't remember if it was 10 or 20% by a certain year. But do you think that's just going to be the norm, that's going to be one of the asks, so to speak, of food service companies to have benchmarks for meat reduction in the same way there is for carbon reduction today?
Absolutely. But I think what has to happen is really a culinary revolution, that we have to get better at creating craveable, delicious, satiating, plant-forward meals. And I very intentionally say plant-forward, not just plant-based. That if you have an item that is 90% plants, but that sprinkling a little gestation crate-free bacon on top of it gets the customer to buy it, that is a win. I don't think it's about purity. I think it's about moving the needle. And so a lot of culinary focus on that.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because such a thing would obviously be very upsetting to vegans, but would actually be great for animals. And there's a big difference between being popular with vegans and doing something that's actually good for animals, as in the case of the Purdue chicken nuggets that you mentioned earlier. These are a 50-50 blend of Purdue chicken plus 50% plant-based material. And, that product has done quite well. It's in over 7,000 supermarkets. It's been on the market for 4 or 5 years now. They keep on expanding the SKUs and people really like it. And the question is, if Purdue just put out a vegan chicken nugget, would it have done anywhere near as well? And I think the answer is clearly not. And it does lead to a pretty substantial reduction in the number of animals who are used for food in that case. And if it were to use the example that you had, which is, 90% reduction in animal use. I mean, if only we could be so successful, that would be truly amazing. Okay. So before we get to this final part of our conversation, Maisie, I'm thinking the book really is good. I do recommend people read it, and I would encourage you. We'll of course link to where you can get it, but it's everywhere books are sold. So if you're interested in making a change in the food system, this is a really good book from somebody who's not just talked about it, but actually done it. Now, speaking of things that are being done, Maisie, what do you want to see done? There's a lot of companies that could exist out there. You've mentioned so many companies, whether they're actual animal companies like Clemens, you mentioned Impossible Foods. Are there any companies that you wish existed that would help this movement toward a more sustainable food system that don't yet exist that you wish existed?
I don't know if I need a new company to exist, but I do wish that as many of the large meat companies have woken up to the, call it an opportunity or call it a threat of plant-based meats and have invested in them, I wish that they would also invest more in the animal welfare of their existing farms. I think we really need a wholesale change, a raising of the floor of what animal welfare minimum standards are. And I say the existing companies, not a new one, because the easy thing would be to say, well, let's start another chicken producer. Let's start another pork producer. But that's still going to leave millions and millions of animals in really poor conditions, both from a welfare standpoint and from an environmental impact standpoint. So we need those guys to make change, not just new companies.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This is why when I was starting my own company, I wanted to do a B2B company to help the big meat producers use fewer animals rather than try to compete against them, rather try to empower them to use fewer animals, which is really what I've devoted the last 6 or 7 years of my life toward. Okay, so with that said, are there resources that you would recommend, Maisie, like things that you think people could benefit from? Obviously, they're going to read your book, but after they do that, what other resources should they check out that you think would be helpful for them?
Well, something that I read religiously is an online publication called Civil Eats, and they've got a newsletter you can sign up for. They are on the forefront of many of the sustainability issues related to food, both environmental as well as social. We haven't talked about the human impacts of people in the supply chain in this conversation, but that's huge, and animal welfare. And for most companies, the things they're talking about are going to be a little too leading edge or bleeding edge. But I think it's really important that you understand where the intellectual conversation around these issues is. And then I would partner that with the NRA Smart Brief. And that's the National Restaurant Association, not the National Rifle Association. And that's a free daily email of a roundup of stories of how they see the food world. And that's going to be more your Applebee's and your mainstream supermarkets and things like that. But I think the combination of those two is really important on a daily, if not weekly basis.
We started the conversation with Applebee's and Walker Hayes. We are finishing the conversation with Applebee's yet again. So, Maisie, it's wonderful to talk to you. When we see each other next, I promise you, we will go to Applebee's and we'll get some Impossible products there together. And thanks so much for all that you have done and are still doing to try to create a better world for humans and non-humans alike through your great work at Bon Appetit and now through this book.
Well, if I could just end by saying that I thank you for all the education that you've given me over this 19-year relationship. And I urge others to find an NGO partner that can be their teacher as you have been for me. So thank you.
It's very generous of you. All right, Maisie, thank you again.
Thanks for listening. I hope you found it useful, and if you did, please let the world know. Leave the show a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app and share the episode with your friends. Who knows? Maybe you'll inspire one of them to be in the business of doing good themselves.